So today we chose to discuss Latin America's uncertain future corresponding to the material associated with week 13 in our syllabus. As a result, this video project will explore the historical buildup that led to the Guinda versus Chevron Texaco case. This prompts us to argue that there was in fact a historical buildup to the case, and that there are plenty of examples of U.S. interventions in Latin America for economic and business interests prior to the case, of which we will explore 4. These 4 will be the Banana Wars in Central America, the sugar intervention in Cuba, the 1954 coup in Guatemala, and the coup against the Goulart government in Brazil. For each of these instances, we will go over the historical context of the intervention, the rhetoric and tactics used by the United States government to justify it, as well as its economic, political, and/or social consequences on the region. This video project will help pose an important question about the future of Latin American society and the extent of the American role within it. This will then allow us to discuss the legacy and impact of the Guinda versus Chevron Texaco legal case of 1993. This video project will help pose an important question about the future of Latin American society and the extent of the American role within it.
The Banana Wars in Central America.
The Banana Wars, by most academic and historical accounts, represent one of the first instances of U.S. intervention in Latin America for business and economic motives. The Banana Wars refers to a series of occupations and interventions led by the United States in Central America and the Caribbean between 1898 and 1934. The most important of these interventions was the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua, which lasted from 1912 to 1933. Such occupations and interventions were primarily justified by the United States government's objective to subvert local, mostly left-leaning, revolutionary insurgencies and turf wars in the region. This is best illustrated in a memorandum written by then Secretary of State Frank Kellogg to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1927, at the height of the occupation in Nicaragua. Kellogg outlines that the United States must make it a priority to continue the occupation in order to fight the resurgence of communism, Bolshevism, and anti-American sentiment in the neighboring Mexico, which he claims is a threat to the United States. This is mostly based on the presupposition that leftist revolutionary groups, including the Communist Party, have risen to prominence in the United States in preceding years. Nonetheless, overlooked by Kellogg is the fact that the United States had already led military interventions in Nicaragua in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s, and had been occupying the country for 15 years, and that these harsh measures directly resulted in the United States possessing monopoly on trade and production in many industries in the region. In fact, the occupation of Nicaragua, as well as the Banana Wars more generally, led to most of the region's agriculture, infrastructure, and railroad construction and maintenance, mining, and banking sectors being dominated by American companies. It includes the Standard Fruit Company, now Dole, and the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, which we will return to later. It is therefore clear that as American financial interests in the region were being threatened by civilian political unrest in the region, the United States government intervened in part to protect such interests, as demonstrated through the Banana Wars.
The sugar intervention in Cuba.
The sugar intervention refers to the events in Cuba between 1917 and 1922, when the United States Marine Corps was stationed on the island. Here we see the defining relationship between the economic conditions of the U.S. and Cuba. Specifically, the World War curtailed sugar production in Europe, resulting in a boom in sugar production in Cuba and a boom in Cuba's economy. Many Caribbean islands were put into sugar production, and numerous new sugar mills were built, some of them funded by U.S. investors. Here we see very clearly how Cuba's economic well-being and the conditions of these sugar mills were increasingly important for U.S. businesses. So much so that whenever Cuban politics curtailed the production of sugar, the U.S. did not hesitate to intervene in the Cuban political landscape. Thus came the sugar intervention. An increase in banditry and illegal sacking of the sugar mills prompted the U.S. to intervene. In August 1917, the U.S. Marines sent the first contingent, consisting of under 1,000 American Marines. During the first year of arrival, U.S. Marines assumed responsibility for the objects of infrastructure related to sugar plantations. This presence of American troops caused anti-American protests, and so, in December 1917, another 1,000 Marines arrived. The primary focus of these troops was to perform patrols of the Cuban sugar mills to ensure their safety and make sure that these sugar production sites were safe to operate. These measures, imposed by the Marines, worked, since in 1918, partially as a result of the actions undertaken, Cuba produced a record sugar harvest. Although disturbances continued in the cities throughout 1918, the United States' answer to these protests was to simply send more Marine troops to the island. By the end of the 1920s, there were around 8,000 naval troops in Cuba. The sugar intervention shows how U.S. involvement in Latin American countries traces way back to a philosophy that arguably stems from the Monroe Doctrine. In the example of the sugar intervention, the U.S. came in, invested a lot of money in the sugar industry, and when these industries started getting targeted by bandits, they sent part of their army to Cuba to protect their economic interests. In our opinion, this case study shows the fact that the U.S. treated Latin American countries as other institutions that can further the economic interests of their government. Guatemala and the United Fruit Company.
The coup d'etat in Guatemala, orchestrated by the Eisenhower administration and the CIA in 1954, overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, who was democratically elected to the Guatemalan presidency 3 years earlier. This event marked the end of the Guatemalan Revolution, which had started in 1944, and culminated in a series of agrarian land reforms enacted by the Arbenz government in 1952 to the discontentment of the United States government and American companies, who supported Ubico's military dictatorship before the revolution. In fact, the reforms aimed to redistribute land among the Guatemalan populace, especially indigenous peoples and locals. A big proportion of the land was, at the time, owned and utilized by the United Fruit Company, a major American company, as well as by other American stakeholders. Despite this fact, the coup was justified by responding to the growing imminent threat of communism and anti-American sentiment in Guatemala, which the United States government claims was a motive for the land reforms. This is particularly exemplified by a memorandum redacted by the State Department in 1953, which outlines in great detail the sentiment towards Guatemala and Arbenz's government taken by the United States government before it covertly invaded Guatemala in 1954. In it, the label communist, or some variant of it, is given more than 20 times to the Arbenz government. Also, the invasion of Guatemala is justified by the United States through moral and political motives, invoking quote-unquote hemispheric solidarity, security, and Cold War-esque tropes throughout the text. Guatemala is even referred to as a primitive country. The tactics to be employed by the CIA during the invasion, including psychological warfare, funding and training local paramilitary operations, and economic pressure, are also detailed and supported by the memorandum. This is all highly disconnected from the reality of the situation, as the Arbenz government was trying to convert the Guatemalan economy into a capitalist system. Furthermore, the invasion was executed through the continuous pressure and lobbying exercised by the United Fruit Company of authoritarian regimes, with few exceptions ever since. Guatemala's democracy and economy were thus doomed to fail by the United States government to protect the business interests of the United Fruit Company and other land-owning companies in Guatemala.
The U.S. backs a coup against Goulard's presidency in Brazil.
Now, we will move on to another case study that shows the United States' involvement in Latin American affairs, namely, the 1964 coup in Brazil against the elected president João Goulart. Here, the role of the U.S. in the coup is well known. The role of the U.S. in the coup stems from the interest of the U.S. capitalist class in inhibiting autonomous, nationalist industrialization in Brazil. We believe the clash between the U.S. and the Goulart government was inevitable and driven by the increasing lack of complementarity between the two national economies once Brazil began to industrialize in the mid-20th century. Thus, the economic interest of imperialistic U.S. corporations made the U.S. government's opposition to Goulart inevitable. There are two main factors that drove a wedge between these two nations. Firstly, the U.S. was engaged in the process of preventive counter-revolution on a world scale that made a clash with Goulart inevitable. This is because Goulart's ideologies were primarily influenced by communist ideas. For example, the U.S. objected to his left-wing tendencies and his willingness to seek closer relations with communist countries. Secondly, Goulard's national policies, such as the agrarian reform and the nationalization of oil, caused the U.S. support for the coup as stemming inevitably from U.S. capitalist desire to stifle autonomous economic development in Brazil. This intervention in the Latin American political landscape reflects that instead of labeling the intervention as a way of furthering their own economic interests, the United States hid their true intentions behind the veil characterized by the idealist clash between communism and capitalism.
The impact and legacy of the Guinda versus Chevron Texaco case.
The Guinda versus Chevron Texaco case represents one of the most impactful attempts of Latin America to demand retribution from a US-based multinational and thereby the United States themselves. In 1993, a group of inhabitants and lawyers from the Lago Agrio region of Ecuador filed a case against Texaco, now Chevron, an oil company, claiming that they had polluted and destroyed the biodiversity of the region during their time drilling and processing oil there. The case bounced around US and Ecuadorian courts, and in 2011, the Ecuadorian Supreme Court stated that Chevron should pay the region $9 billion. Chevron immediately went on the attack, bringing the case back to the US and using their influence in their home country, sued the Ecuadorian state for racketeering, for which the state was forced to pay Chevron $112 million. The case still continues, with the plaintiffs still searching for their $9 billion, a fraction of what would be needed to restore the biodiversity. Meanwhile, Chevron continues to thrive and decimate biodiversity unchecked. Chevron has so far won this case due to their extended influence in the United States and thereby international politics. Yet, this is not the first example of the US dictating Latin American politics in order to ensure their own prosperity. It has often been said that North America thrives because Latin America doesn't. As part of the pressure and intimidation of the Ecuadorian state, Chevron pushed the United States to end their trade and sympathetic relations with Ecuador, which would cut Ecuador off from a global market, one which they could not survive financially without. This tactic was just one of the multitudes that the states has at their disposal, as part of their arsenal intended to destabilize and pressure Latin American states via business and trade relations. The key thing to take from this case is that the Constitution of the United States was changed to allow US-based multinationals to return home and make the most of the supportive legislature when faced with international court cases. This opened the door for other multinationals to continue their exploitative practices and remain practically untouched, a decimating blow for Latin American courts. Indeed, the US gained a more solid foothold in Latin America following this case, not only in the world of business. Almost every major recent crisis in the media has the US pushing its own agenda behind or at the forefront of the scenes. Take Venezuela, for example, with the US heavily funding and supporting their preferential candidate, or Cuba, where the US's embargo has pushed other countries to avoid trade with the country itself. The Guinda versus Chevron case exemplifies how the US takes every measure to ensure that their interests are protected, no matter the cost to Latin America.
What is to be expected?
This video graphic essay discussed the historical precedent to the Guinda versus Chevron Texaco legal case and argued that there is plenty of evidence to indicate that the United States has had a long-standing influence on Latin American society and its political economy. This is based upon the four interventions we have studied, which were the Banana Wars in Central America, the sugar intervention in Cuba, the 1954 coup in Guatemala, and the coup against the Goulart government in Brazil. This poses two important questions, which are to be contemplated in future conversations, about what the future involvement of the United States will be in the region, and about whether any involvement at all is actually morally and politically justified.
Well, I think many U.S. allies in this region, in this hemisphere, those closest to us, welcome the U.S. leadership here under President Trump to keep foreign powers from extending their influence, particularly in Venezuela, which is what I was referring to when I said the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.